It all began when the protagonist, Act, was suddenly fired by the guild master, who claimed he was useless. Act was shocked because he had contributed so much to the guild, but before he could plead his case, the guildmaster ordered some buff daddies to grab and throw him out of the guild for good. A few years later, Act had become successful and built his own guild, swearing never to become as cruel as his previous guildmaster. But one day, he suddenly kicked out a guy named Cage, and the guy felt unfairly treated because he had worked tirelessly for Act's guild. However, Act shockingly revealed that he was sending Cage away because he had found him a better job in the royal capital, with pay that even OnlyFans girls couldn't compete with. Seeing Cage's confusion, Act's personal assistant, Frederica, explained that Act was letting him go because he had heard about his intention to wife up a Latina baddie and understood that he definitely needed a higher income for that to happen. This young lad was surprised at the sudden turn of events and thanked Act for going so far for his own sake. Cage was tearful as he recalled when he was kicked out of his previous guild and Act adopted him into his own guild, improving his talent in blacksmithing until he was a professional. In return, Cage thanked Act one final time and promised to return the favor 100-fold. When he left, Frederica asked Act if he was truly okay letting go of one of their most useful staff, and he replied that he had seen Cage's future with his magic eye and knew the guy would someday run a profitable company. With this knowledge, Act felt it was better to wait until Cage became ultra successful so he could repay his kindness in due time. Soberly reflecting, Act recalled what he experienced at the hands of his own guildmaster and promised that no one else would experience what he did, which was what motivated him to create his own guild where he could adopt rejects like you, refine their skills, and release them back into society. Meanwhile, in the royal capital, a meeting was held to figure out how to subjugate the Demon Lord, and the king concluded that they send an adventurer named Lawrence to subjugate the Demon Lord. But a minister said that Lawrence was too strong for almost everyone he'd ever teamed up with, and they'd need to find him a team for his subjugation task. Just then, the Crown Prince, Edward, suggested that Act help them out, because he's the one who had discovered Lawrence's true skills and trained him while he was still an orphan. However, the minister opposed this idea because Act was stubborn and did things his own way. In the end, the king agreed with Edward, and asked the princess, Alice, to accompany her brother, and her father permitted her to go. Back at Act's guild, Frederica served him breakfast with a slice of cake that was prepared for him by the chef's daughter to thank him for always looking after them. Although Act disliked sugary stuff, he decided to enjoy the cake because he couldn't let the girl's efforts go to waste. Frederica, noticing this, praised Act and commended him for considering the girl's feelings. Later, Act entered the guild, and everyone was excited to see him, so they all flocked around him while Frederica had to keep them from crushing his tiny eggplant. Despite her efforts, a girl named Yoko slipped through the crowd and latched onto Act, crying inconsolably. Frederica told Act that there wasn't time to coddle grown women because he had an important meeting, but he insisted on listening to Yoko because he would always prioritize his employees. Yoko was a special girl because she was once a healer whom Act had adopted but now worked with the Royal Court of Magicians after he had banished her from the guild. Act asked Yoko whether she was no longer satisfied with her new job, but she said it was indeed her dream job. However, the chief named Hegel had started eyeing her twin bazookas and wanted some of those. The man also continually threatened her using his noble status, and her co-workers could only advise her to endure it. Indeed, Yoko wanted to endure the harassment because it was Act who had recommended and provided her with that job, but she could no longer keep it up and wanted to return to working for Act and his guild instead. Listening to her narration, Act was visibly upset, and he remembered back then when Yoko worked enthusiastically as his employee, and she always presented to work even when she was sick because she was too responsible to leave work unless it actually crushed her. Right now, he regretted everything and bowed to her, apologizing for failing to investigate the people he was sending her to work for. Yoko told him it was the chief who was supposed to apologize to her, but she was shocked when Act said he could not accept her request to work for him. This was because Act knew Yoko's childhood ambition was to be a court magician, and since it was his duty to help his subordinates fulfill all their dreams, Yoko also shouldn't give up so easily on her dream. Right then, Act ordered Frederica to make an appointment with the court and swore to teach the Hegel idiot a lesson about what would happen to men who dared lay a finger on those he had personally trained. Immediately, he used his magic communication device and booked a meeting with Hegel in the Royal Court of Magicians. When he got there, Hegel plainly boasted that Act was a mere commoner who was wasting his precious time on nonsense. Ignoring him, Act confronted him for treating Yoko like his pleasure Barbie, but the old fool denied everything, adding that there was no evidence to prove it. Also, Hegel said if Act couldn't come up with substantial evidence against him, he should get out and let Yoko stay for an intimate conversation. Instantly, Yoko felt a terrible anger welling up within her, but Frederica reassured her that Act would resolve everything. Immediately, Act opened his right eye and activated its power, displaying before everyone the moment when Yoko was summoned to Hegel's office, and he squeezed her rice cakes with his ancestral hands. Hegel was ashamed, seeing that he had been caught red-handed, and when he expressed his surprise at Act's ability to display this, Act explained that he had a magical right eye, which replayed past memories that had happened within the environment. Knowing that Act could damage his reputation with that single piece of evidence, the corrupt fool summoned wind magic to end him there and then. However, Act stopped it, slicing through the wind with a simple knife, and at the same time, Frederica flew straight toward Hegel and captured him while he gasped in shock at the fact that Act could predict his magical attack. However, Act said it was all thanks to his special visual ability known as chronosight, in which his right eye showed him the past while his left eye showed him the future and also recognized hidden potential. Hegel was startled because there was no record of anyone with Act's rare ability for the past few centuries, and he couldn't believe a mere commoner could possess such a rare power. Ignoring that, Act said that if Hegel apologized to Yoko and promised never to bother her again, then his offenses would be forgiven and the evidence would never be presented to the public. Instantly, Hegel bowed his head to the ground, apologizing to Yoko and admitting to his wrongdoings as he promised never to do them again. However, Yoko wasn't satisfied, so Act reassured her that it wasn't the end just yet. Most shockingly, he called out to Prince Edward, who had been standing right outside the room and had been listening to the conversation all the while. When Edward stepped in, he bowed slightly to greet Act, and Hegel was surprised to witness the crown prince bow to a mere commoner, which made him question who on earth Act was. At that moment, Act asked Edward whether he had heard every single thing that Hegel confessed, and the prince said he had heard everything down to the last word. With a menacing stare, he called Hegel out as a shameless nobleman who had disgraced the royal court. Hegel claimed that the prince had misunderstood him, but Edward ignored him and announced that his punishment would be even more severe because he tried to dispose of the evidence of his crime. However, Hegel dared to say that all he did was try to taste some of the commoners' juice, but this angered Edward the more, and he said that commoners were equally citizens of the country, and since Hegel didn't understand that simple fact, he was unworthy to be a nobleman. A few days later, Act was informed that Hegel was fired and stripped of his noble status while being charged with numerous crimes in addition to the ones he committed against Yoko. Also, Yoko reported that the new chief was a really nice person and that she was enjoying her work there at the royal court. After delivering her report, Yoko was pretty excited to ask about Act's magic eyes because she had only heard about them, and as a court magic researcher, she wanted to learn more about them. So, Act shared that his eyes weren't omnipotent and had several restrictions. The future events he saw became more blurry as he tried to look further, and sometimes the future may turn out differently from what he had seen. Additionally, a sign that using his magic eye consumed a lot of mana was that he couldn't activate it several times in quick succession. Frederica stated that even though Act certainly had the eyes and the intellect to read into the future, he wasn't all-knowing or some sort of almighty god. After, Yoko offered that if Act ever got into trouble, she would be there to help, and when she left, Frederica praised Act's excellent manner of handling Yoko's case. However, he said all he did was something anyone else would have done, and there was no need for him to be thanked for it. Following that, Frederica smiled and said that he really was an outstanding corrupt guild master. After dealing with Yoko's issues, Edward asked Act to help him nominate people for the Heroes Party who would serve as companions for Lawrence. Act confessed that finding people suitable for the task wouldn't be easy, and Edward said that it was for this precise reason that he needed Act's help, even though the ministers weren't in support. Obviously, Act knew that the ministers were his anti-fans because he wasn't easily influenced by any of them, so none of them could benefit from anything he did. For that reason, Act said he wasn't interested in all that drama because he had ambitions of his own. However, Edward acknowledged that Act was the only one who could achieve that without being part of any factions, and he was desperately needed to secure their country's future. Unfortunately, Act still declined, saying he was no longer interested in the future of that country. Suddenly, Alice burst in angrily, questioning Act's audacity to refuse the royal decree, claiming he didn't care about the country. However, Act remained adamant, saying he absolutely didn't care about the future of the world because that was Lawrence's job, and since Lawrence was no longer one of Act's employees, he could find his own companions himself. Otherwise, the simple implication was that both Lawrence, who was the hero, and the government of their country were so weak that they had to rely on a random commoner such as Act himself to get their jobs done. At this point, all forms of self-restraint left Alice and she grabbed her brother and walked out angrily. Surprisingly, Act said it was too late and dangerous for them to return home and they should stay for the night and return the following day, but Alive blatantly refused to heed his advice. Poor Edward had to apologize and promised he would come back, while Frederica was disgusted by Alice's rudeness, saying she'd held herself back from smacking the brat into order. However, Act told her that what she was planning to do was pointless, and then he said he had an important task for her. Immediately, she realized that he had probably seen something about the future, and that was because Act was sometimes shown the future even without trying to use his magic eye. Unfortunately, most of these random future events turned out to be catastrophic. After he revealed what he had seen, Frederica wondered whether she and Act had to save the siblings, especially rude Alice, but Act said it was simply another step toward achieving his ambition. On the way home, Alice nagged about how rude Act was, but her brother defended him, saying it was truly their own responsibility to defeat the Demon Lord and not Act's. Besides, he felt Act wasn't horrible but simply awkward because he was the kindest man out there and there was a difference between being kind and spoiling people. If Act accepted the royal decree, the ministers might begin to harass him and he might suffer losses which the royal family might never compensate for. And since Act was leading an organization, he had to protect himself and his people instead of bending over like a simp for the royal family. As they argued, their carriage was attacked and a bandit stepped in and instantly recognized them as royalty. Quickly, Edward grabbed his hand to prevent him from using his knife while instructing Alice to run for her life. However, the bandit pushed him backwards and stepped on his hand, and Edward asked the bandit to reveal the identity of the person who hired him. He simply said it was someone who found Edward annoying, and Edward realized this had something to do with the formation of the heroes' party. Even so, Edward said his sister had nothing to do with it, but the bandit said he didn't give a flying hoot as long as he got paid. Right then, Alice tried punching the bandit to let Edward go, but her hardest punch landed like a feather, and the bandit threatened to spank her with his rod of discipline before finishing her off. This angered Edward, who warned the fool not to touch his sister, so he quickly pushed him off and tried to escape with Alice. Unfortunately, there were more cloaked bandits outside their carriage, and they realized that all their guards had been slain. Edward attempted to draw his sword, but before he could do anything, someone sliced his cheek and immediately said the weapon had been laced with poison that spread quickly, meaning Edward would be gone pretty soon. The bandits confessed that they were planning to finish both the royal siblings alongside Act the following day, but because Edward and Alice traveled on their own that night, Act was safe. Immediately, Alice fell to her knees in regret, realizing that all this had happened because she failed to heed Act's advice to spend the night. She began apologizing to her brother, but the bandit told her to ditch her dying brother and part her Red Seas already. Immediately, he began trying to have his way with her, and she screamed for help as he ripped her dress. Right when she was about to give up, Act appeared from behind and said it was too early for her to give up yet, and he called Alice a fool for ignoring his advice to stay put. At the same time, he ignored the worthless burglar who was excited that Act foolishly took him to them, making their job easier. Annoyed that Act had ignored him, the bandit attacked him and Alice asked Act to run. However, Act swiftly dodged the bandit's attack and appeared right behind the idiot, whacking him on the neck and making him pass out. The rest of the bandits were surprised to see their leader fall, while Act took off his cloak and gave it to Alice, saying she shouldn't worry about Edward because he had stopped the poison using an ability in his eyes called localized time control. This ability could manipulate the flow of time within a person's body, and Act used it by stopping the poison from spreading in Edward's body, so he'd be fine as long as he took an antidote later. Alice was relieved that her brother would be alright, while Act turned his attention to the worthless burglars, saying they had failed their mission and should just surrender for their own good. They warned him not to get cocky yet because they could easily call for reinforcements, but Act showed them their so-called reinforcements getting chewed out by his pet monster. Apparently, Act had rounded up the rest of their scum gang in the capital right before arriving at Edward's carriage. Hearing this, the leader of the bandits got furious and ordered his subordinates to attack Act, but he was way too fast for them and disappeared, attacking them before they could react. His fighting technique involved using his localized time control skill along with his magic eyes to accelerate himself and move at god-tier speed. In no time, Act had beaten them all to shades of black and blue, and Alice was completely dazed. From a distance, a carriage approached them and Alice was scared, but Act assured her that those were his people from the Royal Court of Healers. Alice thought deeply, realizing that Act had brought healers to the site almost as if he had anticipated that Edward would get poisoned, so she wondered who on earth this guy really was. After a while, the healers tended to Edward, but Alice soon became dizzy and passed out in Act's arms. Later that night, the minister who had contracted the assassins was speechless after hearing that the assassination attempt on the prince and princess had been an absolute failure. He dialed the number of the assassin's leader, trying to confirm whether they had truly failed his mission. But quite oddly, the phone rang behind him, and Frederica appeared with it, throwing the chopped-off arm belonging to one of the assassins the minister had hired. The old fool was terrified, but Frederica bowed courteously, saying she was there on behalf of Act, who was known as the Grim Reaper. Suddenly, the minister's phone rang again, and Frederica ordered him to pick it up because Act was on the other end of the line. When Act declared that he destroyed the Guild of Assassins, the minister denied it, saying there was no way such a powerful guild could be destroyed so easily. Realizing that he was merely deceiving himself, the minister offered to pay Act any sum of money he demanded, knowing that Act was some sort of villain who prioritized his own interests over world peace and hoping that they could even join forces. Suddenly, he heard a crack behind him and began shivering, only to realize that Frederica had summoned ice and was about to freeze him to death because he dared to compare himself with Act. In no time, the minister was literally iced out, and Frederica reported that her mission was complete. The next day, Alice humbly apologized to Act and thanked him for saving her and Edward, but he advised her to heed sound advice when given. This time around, instead of getting mad at him for sounding in his usual cocky manner, Alice realized that he was simply a genuine person who never failed to tell the truth as it was. Thereon, she began a conversation about the assassin, saying the minister who was behind it had confessed to all his crimes, and was terrified for his dear life. Alice was confused, though, wondering why Act was willing to go so far to help her and Edward. But he said he only did it for his personal gain because if the assassins were ever to go after Edward and Alice again, they would likely come after him since he was now associated with them. Alice didn't quite understand how he was associated, until Act under her that Edward was forming the Heroes Party and that he himself would be helping him as an advisor. Immediately, Alice understood that Act had made himself one among many advisors to avoid being placed in the spotlight against the opposition. She wondered why Act had refused them earlier, and Frederica explained that Act had intended on helping Edward the whole time, and the proof was in the list of candidates she had just brought into the office. Apparently, Act had long been gathering a list of suitable candidates, even way before Lawrence was selected as the hero. Now that Alice understood everything, Act told her to go away because she was wasting his time. However, she asked him for permission to stay with them for a short time because she had yet to completely trust him and wished to find out whether he was a good or a bad person with her own eyes. Obviously, Frederica wasn't going to let anyone stay that close to her man, so she was against the idea until Alice showed them a royal decree from her father, the king, stating that she should stay in Act's guild as his aide until the selection of the Heroes Party was over. Since Act could no longer refuse, he permitted Alice to serve under him as his aide, but Frederica was angry because she had been his only assistant all along. Act simply instructed her to show Alice the ropes, and Frederica fussed about it, warning that she wouldn't go easy on Alice, whether or not she were royalty. When they were both alone, Act said he was aware that Alice had only created that flimsy excuse to stay with him, but now that she was part of the guild, he would work her to the bone with his bone. On the other hand, Alice said that was the perfect chance for her to find out whether he was truly a corrupt guild master, and Act simply told her to do as she pleased. Far out in an eastern desert of their kingdom, a caravan full of adventurers was attacked by a behemoth, and it was to shoot its fatal breath upon them, so they thought it was all over. However, a voice behind them said it was too early to give up, and a hero named Lawrence appeared and defeated the monsters so effortlessly. The adventurers thanked him, but he said it was his job as a hero to protect the people. When they asked him why he was out there alone in the desert, he claimed that his party members said they could no longer keep up with him. But he also encouraged them not to worry about him because he would find new party members soon enough, since his most trusted person was working tirelessly to find him new members. Meanwhile, Act woke up that same morning to find Frederica warning Alice not to be the third wheel between her and Act. Alice assumed that they were in a romantic relationship, and Frederica boasted that they certainly were, but to her utmost dismay, Act appeared from behind and flatly denied ever dating her, saying she was just a servant. This made Frederica deeply sad until Act eventually acknowledged that they had a special relationship only they could enjoy. After breakfast, Alice thanked Act for a certain hair clip he had gifted her, but Frederica was jealous until he said that the hair clip was a magic tool to change her appearance, which was important for someone like Alice, being a princess. Later, some of the guild members bombarded Act with questions about Alice's identity and introduced her as their apprentice. The others wanted Frederica and Alice to have fun with them, but Act said that it was time to work, and when Alice asked if they ever had days off, he said that each person had 2 days off every week because if workers didn't rest, their performance typically degraded. Apparently, their guild worked on a 5-day workweek system where living expenses were provided for half a year after joining, and they gave discounts to guild members. Also, they never took on dangerous or overnight quests. And since Act's mansion was right behind the guild, he could easily respond to emergencies. Act said that Frederica was saying a little too much to Alice and bombarding her with details she didn't have to know, but Frederica said it was the perfect opportunity to use Alice to spread the news that Act was such a kind and thoughtful guildmaster to his members. Agreeing with her, Alice said that there truly were no other guilds that were so thoughtful toward their members as Act was toward his, and it felt like they were all trying to fool her into believing he was a kind man. Walking away, Act said he had no time to waste trying to fool anybody, not especially her, and the chit-chat was eating into the time they were supposed to use to work. Alice wasn't happy about this, but Frederica explained that that was exactly who Act was, a man who always frowned and spoke candidly, even though deep down he was a very kind person. As work began in earnest, each of the guild members reported one after another to keep Act up to date with their activities, and Alice asked whether the morning greeting was mandatory for all members, but Frederica said they were only doing it because they genuinely loved being around Act. Feeling very proud of her master, because he was the nicest person ever, Frederica jokingly described herself as the love doll he could always have in a chokehold. Later, Alice observed that Act's guild had very few members despite being the second strongest S-rank adventurer guild, but she learned that it was because many of their members eventually left the guild. Alice wondered why people would leave a guild that had such a great work environment, but suddenly, Act said a perfect time had arrived for him to showcase what kind of person he was. A knock on the door was heard, and a guy named Kimmies walked in after being summoned by Act. Looking at this lad, Alice thought he was way too young to be working at that age, but even more shockingly, Act suddenly broke the news that Kimmies was now fired and that he should get out of the guild. This time around, Alice bashed Act for being so cruel and banishing Kimmies from the guild for no good reason, but Act said he was doing so because Kimmies was weak and not suited to be an adventurer, because such a job required having a strong body. Still, Alice protested that Act was being unfair because he knew this way before hiring Kimmies, but Act acted nonchalantly, saying he no longer needed the boy. The poor soul admitted that he wasn't very useful around, so he was just content that he got to stay for so long. However, Frederica handed Kimmies information about his next workplace, and Act pointed out that Kimmies was weak physically, but his alchemy skills were first-rate, and he had found an alchemy guild master who was looking for a capable new hand. In a nutshell, Act had gotten Kimmies a job as an alchemist in the capital with a much higher paid grade and was even offering to pay his moving expenses. Seeing this, the guy was thrilled and thanked Act, promising to do his very best at his new job. As he left, Alice expressed her surprise at the whole turnout of events because she had never seen any guild prepare another job and even pay moving expenses for their banished staff. As expected, Act claimed it was all for his personal ambition, and it boggled Alice's mind as she wondered what sort of ambition required Act to create a guild only to kick out its members. By nightfall, Act had banished 5 people in total, and Alice confessed that she now understood why so many people spread terrible rumors about Act's guild, although she now thought him to be a very kind and thoughtful man. Frederica was excited that Alice finally understood that Act never banished people without a good reason, unlike the other guild masters. Later, when he got home, Act continued working overtime, trying to draft a list of possible new members to join Lawrence's party. When Frederica read the newspaper headlines and found that Lawrence had defeated a fatal tier behemoth in one hit, she wondered whether they could ever find suitable party members for him. However, Act said he already had one person in mind, a spearman with a nasty personality problem. Frederica said she was pretty sure it would be alright and advised him not to push himself too far and to take care of his body, but he told her he didn't need anyone telling him what to do because he was about to head to bed anyway. Realizing that he had hurt her feelings, he asked her to massage his sore shoulders, and in turn, he could ride her Kit Kat until it was sore. Meanwhile, in a faraway land, some adventurers encountered a horde of 100 orcs. They were all driven to panic and wanted to give up already when suddenly one dude popped up, calling them pathetic and instantly defeating those orcs single-handedly. He then told them to sit back and be thankful because he was none other than Olgar, the genius spearman who had come to save them with his magnificent spear attacks. The next day, Lawrence paid a visit to Act's guild, and Alice could barely restrain herself from grabbing him and doing crazy things to him. She introduced herself while Lawrence advised her to take good care of Act and give it to him as he wanted. Getting straight to the business of the day, Act told Lawrence that he had found a member of his party. Afterwards, Olgar, a literal Rapunzel with family jewels, stepped forward pompously and introduced himself as an unparalleled spearman, reassuring Lawrence not to worry because he would be his companion. However, Act said Olgar shouldn't even bother because he could guarantee that Olgar wasn't even fit to work with Lawrence. Olgar was mad and questioned Act's guts to assume such a thing, but Act told him he knew his personality more than anyone else and that Olgar currently wasn't good enough. Annoyed, Olgar said he'd quit the guild so Act wouldn't interfere in his life anymore, and he'd just go ahead and become Lawrence's companion and climb up to glory. Nonchalantly, Act told Lawrence to suit himself, and the idiot walked away, saying Act would soon be proud to have had such an adventurer as him in the guild. As Olgar dragged Lawrence along, Act reminded the fool that since he was quitting on his own, he should never come crawling back and begging to get back in. In response, Olgar said he had no reason to ever beg to get back in because he'd defeat the Demon Lord with the hero and scream "Mama, I'm famous" like YouTube comments section heroes. Right after this, Olgar turned to leave, but before Lawrence joined him, he exchanged a quick glance with Act and nodded, communicating a secret understanding between them. Afterwards, Alice complained that Olgar was rude and unpleasant to Act despite all he had done for him, but Act assured her to calm down because she was only wasting her time fuming like that. Next, she asked Act why he hadn't actually told Olgar that he had him in mind as a potential member of the hero's party, but Act said she'd know why he did that soon enough. Indeed, 2 weeks later, Lawrence placed a call to the guild, sharing that Olgar had suddenly disappeared and left no trace. Actually, Olgar was at a bar, nagging about the intense training he was forced to go through under Lawrence's tutelage when all he wanted was to become the guy's companion and defeat the Demon Lord. Apparently, Lawrence was forcing him to run 100 kilometers and swing his spear 10,000 times, so Olgar just felt that the guy was after his life. Suddenly, while Olgar was still sulking, a guy named Fyodor appeared before him, instantly recognizing and praising him as the strongest spearman in the world. Almost immediately, Olgar snapped out of his misery as Fyodor fed his ego, and Fyodor introduced himself as a headhunter who was seeking highly talented individuals like Olgar to become combat instructors in their guild. While Olgar wasn't quite convinced about such a job, Fyodor explained that there were tons of people eager to learn from a skilled martial artist like Olgar, and with a menacing look on his face, Fyodor said that more people would appreciate Olgar for teaching them martial arts rather than for just defeating enemies for them. Somehow, Olgar still wasn't convinced until Fyodor pointed out that if all he did was defeat the Demon Lord with Lawrence as the hero, then all the glory would go to Lawrence and people wouldn't recognize Olgar's efforts. With this knowledge, Olgar realized that Lawrence was indeed way too strong and could probably handle the Demon Lord by himself, but just as he was about to seal the deal with Fyodor, Act appeared from behind, instantly taking them by surprise. Apparently, Act and Fyodor recognized each other from way back, and Olgar disgracefully turned his head away the moment he made eye contact with Act. Of course, Act confronted Olgar, saying he looked pretty terrible and that he had heard about Olgar running away, even though the spineless little coward denied it. However, Act said it was obvious Olgar ran away because Lawrence's training was too intense for him, which was why Act had told Olgar a small fry like him couldn't keep up with Lawrence. As expected, Act was pressing the right buttons and frustrating Olgar, but he justified his statement by saying Olgar realized he was no match for Lawrence, so he ran away with his tail between his legs because he was too weak. That instant, Olgar was fed up and decided to prove he was no wimp by challenging Act to a duel. He said that if Act lost, he would have to take back his words of calling him a small fry, while Act said that if he won, then Olgar would admit that he was a weak little wimp. In Olgar's mind, he couldn't believe Act had fallen for this because he assumed that all guild masters could only deadlift stacks of paper and walk around with flabby potbellies like you. As Fyodor watched the whole encounter, he acknowledged that Act was a pretty smart individual because only minutes earlier, when Fyodor had encountered Olgar, the guy looked like he was about to break down crying for his mama. But right now, he was willing to go as far as challenging Act to a duel just to prove himself. They later arrived at Act's guild, and Lawrence learned that Olgar was back, so he welcomed him excitedly. However, Olgar said he wasn't returning to the guild and had come only to beat the living daylights out of Act. The moment Alice heard this, she was against the idea, but Lawrence reassured her that Act was actually pretty strong and quite capable himself. In fact, he reminded her that Olgar was only stronger than the average S-rank adventurer thanks to Act's training, which meant Act was more than capable. Even after hearing this, Olgar didn't buy the idea that Act was strong, and he swore he would make him cry like a little girl. To his utmost shock, his very first attack, which was carried out with superhuman speed, was somehow avoided by Act, and instead, Act made him trip over his foot and fall flat to the ground. Next, Act taunted him, so Olgar angrily got back up and threw a barrage of repeated punches, but each punch was dodged by Act in perfect time, and again, Olgar plopped to the ground defeated, looking so pathetic that Act wondered how on earth he had hoped to join the hero's party and be useful there. To worsen matters, Act revealed that he hadn't even moved from his original standing spot, and yet, Olgar had failed to lay as much as a scratch on him, despite Act not even being a combatant. Gritting his teeth in frustration, Olgar said he wasn't done yet because he was the world's strongest spearman after all. Surprisingly, Olgar suddenly got lit from head to toe with tremendous magical power, and he was hopeful that this time he'd finally have an edge over Act. However, Act dodged him again, and Olgar still ended up on the ground, furious that he had failed to prove himself yet again. Sadly, Act confirmed the truth that Olgar was obviously weak, but the fool refused to accept it and challenged Act to another duel where he could prove himself for real. However, Act said he could never achieve success against him, no matter how many times he tried, because he had his priorities elsewhere. As he walked out, Act gestured for Lawrence to take over, and Lawrence walked over to the crybaby Olgar, assuring him that he had pulled off a really commendable fight, especially with his final attack. This gave Olgar a boost of confidence that made him swear he'd get stronger and beat Act to a pulp someday. Days later, Alice burst excitedly into Act's office, sharing that Lawrence and his party had recently defeated a group of devils and Olgar had reportedly made significant contributions, including taking down the leader of the devils. Act listened but seemed unfazed, and Alice instantly understood that the duel Act had with Olgar was meant to motivate him. She acknowledged that Act was genuinely a kind person, and even though Act said she was overthinking it, Alice said she wasn't and admitted that she really liked that about him. Soon, she realized she had just confessed her feelings to him and her face turned cherry red as she quickly explained that she didn't really mean any of what she had just said. As she left, Frederica was obviously jealous and realized she couldn't let her guard down so carelessly, or Alice would snatch her man. Act advised her not to show her ears and tail in front of others, but she commented on how clueless he was when it came to understanding ladies' emotions. After a while, Frederica told Act that Olgar was reportedly taking his training seriously, and she hugged Act, saying that he made Olgar leave the guild so he wouldn't have any other choice but to work hard in the hero's party. As usual, Act said she was overthinking it, but Frederica said she understood his kindness, no matter how clumsy it was, because no other person would understand him that way. As they stood to leave, she promised that even if everyone else ever hated him, she would never leave him and would stay by his side until the end. Hearing this, Act told her to do whatever she pleased, and as they enjoyed that intimate moment, Fyodor, who was suspended in the sky, was spying on them through the window. He made a mental note that thanks to Act, the hero's party had become stronger, but the very fact that Act was still alive was a problem because Fyodor was supposed to report the progress of his mission to a higher-up who may not be pleased. However, it was even more surprising that Frederica was still alive even after Fyodor had thrown her into the depths of an abyss, because she could interfere with their plan. In the end, he decided to just wait and see what would happen. While he was busy spying on them, it seemed Act and Frederica were too distracted to notice him, but what he didn't know was that Act had already noticed his presence. Early the next morning, the strongest adventurer of the guild, Rosalia, excitedly ran in to suffocate Act with her overpumped airbags, saying she missed him and felt so lonely that she thought she might die. When Frederica had seen just enough to get her pissed, she demanded that Rose get her filthy body off Act. Rosalia ignored her, saying she didn't even notice her, and Act said he wanted to introduce a new member to Rosalia. He also told Frederica to serve them some tea, and she was so angry that he could practically feel her fury. In his office, Rosalia asked Act whether he wanted some action because she was more than willing to offer herself as dinner. However, he told her to stop speaking as she belonged to the streets. Besides, he never had any intention of developing plot with members of his guild. On to the main topic, Act said he would be banishing Rosalia, and immediately, a fairy named Misery suddenly appeared, with an attitude just like her name, yelling at Act for banishing her master. Apparently, Rosalia had rescued Misery from a fire dragon, and because the fairy had nowhere else to go, Rosalia adopted her. Feeling ignored by Act, Misery summoned a whirlwind and slammed him against the bookshelf, calling him a weakling and a wimp who wasn't worthy of being Rosalia's guild master. On the other hand, Act was impressed by the fairy's magic talent and permitted her to join his guild. The fairy further threatened to beat up Act some more, so Rosalia told her to go outside and cool her head off. Angrily, the little one said she hated Rosalia because she was only defending her from Act and wasn't being appreciated for that. As she left, Rosalia apologized for Misery's behavior, but Act said he didn't care about her attitude because he never hired adventurers based on their attitudes. Immediately, he got a guild card for Misery, and she nagged so much about him when she was assigned her first mission. Her team members told her that Act was a very kind guild master, and she would only come to understand that with time. Just then, Rosalia noticed a hidden passage, which was identified as a wall made out of illusions. Rosalia wanted to check it, and one of the team members wanted to confirm whether there were any traps, but Misery jumped right into it and Rosalia had to pull her out, warning her that it was dangerous. When they teleported through the portal, they found themselves standing right before a treasure, and Misery was pretty excited, praising herself for getting them to that point of treasure. Immediately, the rest of the members were wide-eyed, and Rosalia said they should get out of there ASAP, but by then, Misery had already touched the treasure, which began melting the moment she touched it. Suddenly, they were teleported into a big room, and before they knew what was happening, the whole room began rumbling, and they realized they were in the room of the dungeon boss. Instantly, everyone was thrown into panic, but Rosalia reminded them to stick to their training. Meanwhile, Theodore was watching them through a glass globe and was thankful that Misery had the survival instincts of a mosquito because she had landed them right into his trap. Apparently, his primary mission for now was to get rid of Rosalia because she was another powerful member of Act's guild. Back at the guild, Misery suddenly appeared at the dining table, begging Act to save Rosalia and confessing that she had triggered a teleportation trap that sent all her party members directly to the dungeon boss's room. The rest of the adventurers were terrified because taking down a dungeon boss would require a party of at least 30 people, so they advised Misery to escape with her team members. However, Act said that no one could leave a dungeon boss room without defeating the boss, but everyone else wondered how the fairy got there in the first place. Apparently, Act knew that it wasn't her real body that was right there with them, because her real body was trapped right there with the dungeon boss. Hearing this herself and seeing that Act really knew everything, Misery became humble and acknowledged that it was all her fault that her master, Rosalia, was trapped there, so she begged them all to help save Rosalia. They excitedly said they would help her out, but Act reminded them that the dungeon boss would be difficult even for Rosalia, who was the strongest in the guild, meaning the rest of them could do practically nothing against it. He immediately summoned Frederica, and she appeared instantly, saying she had made the necessary preparations. With that, the other adventurers told Misery that everything was okay because Act had a plan and Frederica was a very strong lady. Misery suddenly felt guilty for her previous behavior and wondered why Act was going to save her party even though she had been rude to them before. However, Act said he wasn't doing it for them but rather because he had sent Rosalia on that mission, and it was his responsibility to ensure she was safe because he couldn't afford to lose someone like her. Curious, Misery asked to know what Act could even do about the situation, but Frederica told her to hold on because she would soon realize that Act was not only a merciful guild master but also one man who was full of surprises. They arrived in haste at the dungeon boss's room, and in no time, they saw Rosalia desperately fighting against the dungeon boss all by herself. The monster's tentacles were pretty tough for her to cut through, so she applied a skill known as triple thrust, which shredded one of the monster's tentacles in half. Seeing that it worked, she applied the skill a couple more times and aimed straight for the monster's body. But before she knew it, all the parts she had tirelessly chopped off had started regenerating at breakneck speed, and she was running out of options as she realized she couldn't do this on her own. Before anything bad could happen to her, Act swiftly grabbed her away from danger and took her to safety, and Frederica transformed into her giant beast wolf form, where she began chewing on the monster's tentacles. As Frederica dealt with the monster, Rosalia was pleased that Act came to save her, but he adamantly said that it was Misery who begged him to come. Excitedly, Misery rushed to meet Rosalia and asked where the rest of them were. Apparently, the fairy on her own had been protecting the others with a barrier. When Act got there, He found that one of the guys was wounded, so he used his localized time control to slow the progression of the injury on his body, which stopped the pain and bleeding. Afterward, he praised Misery for protecting her teammates and calling for help, and then asked them to leave the rest to him. The party members offered to join forces and take down the monster, but Act reminded them that they barely survived it the first time and should focus on staying protected while he dealt with the monster alongside Frederica and Rosalia. As Frederica kept chewing on the monster's third and fourth legs, they only kept hyper-regenerating, and Act said they would need a huge number to overwhelm the monster's regeneration speed. However, Rosalia said they were only 3, and if they needed numbers, they would need to be far more than that. But Act believed that just the 3 of them were enough to defeat the monster. In that instant, Frederica froze all of the monster's tentacles, but it surprisingly grew new ones. Rosalia suddenly charged toward the monster, and Act warned her she could get herself killed, but she said she had found an edge for them to win. Right there and then, she stabbed through the monster while Act jumped and grabbed one of the monster's horns, looking straight into its eyes and saying that it would pay for hurting his own people with its own life. With that, he unleashed his evil eye, and the monster was blasted away, falling to its defeat. As Act defeated the monster, Misery was in shock to behold such an excellent guild master. But at the same time, Act fell backwards onto the ground, and Frederica rushed to protect his body before it could hit the floor. Afterwards, she transformed back to her normal self, and they asked Act what exactly he had done to the monster. So he responded that he used a skill that completely stopped time for anyone who looked into his eyes. However, he began staggering and both girls were worried, but he reassured them that he had only lost his balance and there was nothing to worry about. A few days later, Misery appeared before Act, looking rather sober and sorry for the mistakes she had made in the dungeon. She decided she would leave Rosalia and the guild for good because she had been causing everyone so much trouble, especially Act, who now had a patch on his eye for her sake. However, Act told her that she was a newbie who had only just joined the guild, and newbies causing trouble was nothing new. He also praised her for an excellent support role in the dungeon and then passed her a guild card announcing that he had approved her as a member of his guild. Misery couldn't believe her ears, and Act told her that he noticed how she admitted her mistakes quickly and rushed to seek help while doing everything within her power, which made him realize she was someone who could put aside her pride and do the right thing. With that, he urged her to keep supporting Rosalia's party, and the tearful Misery promised she would do her utmost best for his sake. At the same time, Rosalia was happy for her girl, but then she got suspended for putting her party in danger. Misery was shocked and told Act that it was her fault because she was the one who endangered the party, but Act said that it was the party leader's responsibility to keep the party safe. In any case, he told Rosalia that there was a resort prepared for her at a beachfront and her party would be confined there during the suspension period for half a month, during which they would be free to do whatever they wanted. While Act paid for their living expenses, Rosalia realized that Act had basically given her an expense-free vacation. She gladly accepted the offer, and when they were at the beach, Misery asked Rosalia why Act wanted to banish her. She responded that Act wanted her to join the hero Lawrence's party, but she turned the offer down because she didn't want to leave Act since she was in love with him. She added that Act was such a kind guy who always considered the future of his members, even though he claimed to be banishing them, and even when they left the guild, he was always willing to take them back if that would make them happy. Hearing this about Act's true nature, Misery felt bad about the way she treated him. But Rosalia told her that Act would certainly forgive her and take responsibility for her mistakes towards him. Instantly, Misery started blushing and had to deny that she had started falling for Act. Much later, Act and Frederica returned to the dungeon where they had fought the boss. Apparently, Act found it strange that Misery, who was a pretty skilled fairy, couldn't detect the teleportation trap, meaning it wasn't just a trap but that someone had cast teleportation magic on Rosalia's party. Frederica reasoned that since teleportation magic was high-level magic, the caster must be a very skilled magician, and Act said he couldn't find the caster anywhere nearby, meaning they must have done it from afar. Immediately, Frederica realized that whoever did this had specifically tried to avoid Act's magical eyes, which was why they acted from a distance, but Act told her to calm down, as he was pretty upset gingerly. What truly angered him was knowing that someone had tried to take the lives of his valuable guild members. At this point, Act was digging his nails into his palms, causing them to bleed, so Frederica told him to take a deep breath and calm down. Finally, Act accepted that whoever had plotted this evil had gotten them good, but he swore that one day he would pay them back for what they had done. How soon will heads come flying when Act starts looking for answers? Will his revenge mission be successful? Comment Feisty Freddy 4 Part 2 and drop a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. As usual, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.